The voicemail came in at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning while I was still in my driveway with the engine running. Dana, don't come in through the south entrance. OSHA's already here. I turned the radio off. Sat there listening to the faint clicking sound my Lexus made when the engine idled too long. Then Barry Collins lowered his voice. They're asking for the lockout tagout escalation files. The originals. Greg says he can't find them. Of course he couldn't. Because Greg Whitmore had called my standards fear-based operational theater 3 months earlier in conference room B and escorted me out of the building like I was stealing office supplies instead of leaving behind 18 years of my life. I remember looking at the security guard standing beside the door that afternoon. Poor kid couldn't have been older than 22. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Neither would anyone else. Not even after the ammonia leak in packaging line 4. Not even after the forklift brake failures. Not even after I warned them 7 separate times in writing that someone was eventually going to get hurt. I put the car in reverse and backed out of my driveway slowly. By then, OSHA was already walking the floor with copies of every report they ignored. And my name was on all of them. My name is Dana Mercer. I was 47 years old when they pushed me out of Ridgeline Industrial Packaging in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I spent 18 years there. The last 9 as Director of Plant Safety and Regulatory Compliance. When I started, Ridgeline had 3 OSHA recordables a quarter and workers' comp losses averaging $940,000 annually. By the time Greg Whitmore arrived with his MBA vocabulary and polished loafers, I had reduced incident rates by 63%, cut insurance exposure by $2.4 million over 6 years, and built the internal compliance system that kept the company off federal audit lists for almost a decade. That system was called Sentinel. Not particularly creative. I named it at 2 in the morning during a 14-hour shutdown while eating stale crackers from a vending machine. Sentinel tracked machine maintenance lapses, lockout violations, chemical handling certifications, contractor access logs, near misses, forklift telemetry, and every safety escalation filed inside the plant. If a supervisor ignored a hazard report longer than 72 hours, Sentinel automatically escalated it to department leadership and archived the timestamps permanently, meaning nobody could later claim they weren't aware. That detail becomes important. I also built CrossCheck, which audited production quotas against safe operational thresholds. Simple concept. If supervisors started pushing impossible output numbers, CrossCheck flagged increased accident probability based on overtime fatigue, maintenance deferrals, and staffing shortages. The production managers hated CrossCheck because CrossCheck had receipts. Over 18 years, I missed 2 Christmas mornings, 1 funeral, and an anniversary trip to Vancouver because of emergency shutdowns of the plant. My ex-husband once told me Ridgeline got the best years of my attention while he got whatever energy was left over after compliance reviews. He wasn't entirely wrong. But the plant mattered to me because the people mattered to me. Factory safety isn't abstract when you've personally watched a man lose 3 fingers because a supervisor skipped lockout protocol to save 19 minutes on a production restart. I watched that happen in 2011. Different company, different job. But you don't really forget the sound someone makes after something like that. So yes, my standards were high. Apparently that became inconvenient. Greg Whitmore arrived in February. 34 years old. New Vice President of Operations. Son of Ridgeline CEO Thomas Whitmore. There it was. The entire explanation wrapped neatly in one last name. The company announced him during an all-hands meeting in the cafeteria. Thomas stood beside him smiling like he'd just unveiled a new luxury sedan. Greg brings a fresh operational philosophy, he said. Efficiency-driven leadership for a changing manufacturing landscape. Greg nodded like he'd invented manufacturing. He wore a navy suit that cost more than most supervisors made in a week, but the sleeves were slightly too long and the collar bunched awkwardly behind his neck. Like he bought it because someone told him executives should dress expensive. First thing he did was rename departments. Second thing he did was start talking about lean safety integration, which sounded impressive until you realized he didn't actually understand what those words meant. During his second week, he walked through assembly with me and pointed at a lockout station. Do we really need all these redundant tagging procedures? He asked. They're federally required. Required or recommended? Required. He smiled slightly. Everything's negotiable if you understand operational leverage. That sentence told me almost everything I needed to know. By April, he'd started overriding shutdown recommendations during maintenance holds. Not directly, of course. Men like Greg rarely give dangerous orders themselves. They create atmospheres where other people feel pressured to make dangerous decisions for them. There's a difference. One afternoon, I walked into Production Bay 3 and found maintenance crews servicing a conveyor without full energy isolation. I pulled the emergency stop immediately. Supervisor named Eli Ramirez looked relieved when he saw me. Greg said we could do rolling maintenance, Eli muttered quietly. You can't. He said full lockouts are killing throughput metrics. I looked over at Greg standing near the floor manager with a tablet tucked under his arm like a prop. Dana, he said loudly, we're trying to modernize processes here. Modern OSHA regulations still require lockout procedures. He gave a little laugh. You always talk like there's an inspector hiding behind every pallet. There eventually is. That shut him up for maybe 6 seconds. Then he turned to the floor manager. See? This is exactly the institutional thinking holding this place back. Institutional thinking. That's what 18 years of keeping people alive became. 2 weeks later, he held a leadership meeting in Hawthorne Conference Room on the 2nd floor. Glass walls. Artificial ficus tree in the corner. Air conditioning always too cold. Greg stood beside a PowerPoint slide titled Operational Agility Initiative. I remember that because he misspelled initiative. Twice. We've identified excessive procedural bottlenecks within compliance operations, he announced. Nobody said anything. Then he clicked to a slide showing delayed production metrics. My department highlighted in red. These safety holds cost us approximately 400 labor hours last quarter. I leaned back in my chair. Those safety holds prevented 3 uncontrolled startups and 1 chemical exposure incident. Greg smiled without looking at me. That's one interpretation. I heard someone exhale sharply across the table. Linda Cho from HR, smart woman. She'd already figured out what kind of situation this was becoming. I opened my folder calmly. Page 14, I said. Greg frowned. Excuse me. The report you're referencing excludes corrective action savings and workers' comp avoidance. Page 14 contains the actual net impact analysis. Silence. He flipped pages too fast. Finally found it. His face changed slightly when he saw the numbers. Projected avoided liability, $3.1 million. I watched him realize in real time that he'd walked into the meeting unprepared. So naturally he doubled down. Dana, he said carefully, sometimes leadership requires balancing theoretical risk against operational realities. Theoretical risk. Interesting phrase to use about industrial amputations. After the meeting, Linda caught up with me near the elevators. He's going to come after your department, she said quietly. I know. You documented everything? I looked at her. Linda gave a tiny nod. Okay, good. That became the pattern for the next 5 months. Greg pushed production targets higher. I filed escalation reports. Greg delayed maintenance shutdowns. I documented override approvals. Greg started bypassing department review chains entirely. I archived every email. The thing about competent people is we usually see collapse coming long before anyone else does. Not because we're smarter. Because we're paying attention while everyone else is performing confidence. In June, a forklift lost braking pressure near loading dock C. Nobody died because the operator slammed the vehicle sideways into stacked pallets instead of the pedestrian lane. The repair logs later showed deferred hydraulic maintenance dating back 11 weeks. I submitted violation escalation 22 to 417 at 4:42 p.m. that same day. High priority. Unresolved. Then came the ammonia issue. Packaging line 4 used industrial refrigeration systems that required regular valve inspections. We were overdue by 19 days because Greg suspended non-essential maintenance downtime during what he called throughput optimization quarter. One of the valves failed during overnight shift. Minor leak. Contained quickly. But ammonia spreads fast in enclosed environments. 6 workers were treated for respiratory irritation. I filed another escalation. Then another. Then another. 7 total unresolved safety violations over 2 years. Every single one documented through Sentinel. Every single one acknowledged electronically by operations leadership, including Greg. That detail also becomes important. The meeting where they fired me happened on September 14th at 3:30 p.m. Conference room V. No windows. The room smelled faintly like burnt coffee and dry erase markers. Greg sat at the far end of the table beside Linda from HR and outside counsel from Des Moines named Patrick Heller. Expensive haircut. Cheap posture. There was already a folder sitting in front of my chair when I walked in. That told me this wasn't a discussion. Greg folded his hands carefully. Dana, thank you for joining us. I sat down without touching the folder. Am I being terminated? Linda looked uncomfortable immediately. Patrick jumped in too quickly. We prefer to frame this as a leadership transition. Of course you do. Greg leaned back. After evaluating operational priorities, we've concluded your compliance methodology no longer aligns with Ridgeline's strategic direction. I almost smiled. Compliance methodology. Such elegant corporate language for, you won't ignore federal law when we ask. What specifically no longer aligns? I asked. Greg exchanged a glance with Patrick. We believe your department has created unnecessary operational friction through excessive escalation practices. There it was. Excessive escalation practices. Meaning written documentation. Meaning accountability. I looked at Linda. She looked down at the table. That part disappointed me more than I expected. Greg continued talking. Something about restructuring. Something about modernization. Something about culture alignment. Honestly, once people start lying professionally, the sentences all blur together eventually. Then came the part 1 remember clearly. We're prepared to offer 12 weeks severance contingent upon execution of standard non-disparagement agreements. I opened the folder slowly. The severance agreement was already tabbed for signature. Prepared in advance. Efficient. I closed the folder again. No, I said. Greg blinked. No, I'll resign instead. Patrick straightened slightly. Dana, I'd encourage you to review. I understand exactly what it says. Silence settled over the room. The air conditioning hummed overhead. Somewhere outside the conference room somebody laughed at something near the break area. Normal office sounds continuing while careers ended behind closed doors. Greg recovered first. Well, he said, that's certainly your decision. Yes. I reached into my bag and removed a sealed manila envelope. I'm submitting my final audit package simultaneously with my resignation. Copies have already been distributed through compliance channels. Greg frowned slightly. What audit package? Open it after I leave. That got his attention. Patrick looked irritated immediately. Linda looked nervous. Good instincts on her part. I stood. 18 years in that building, and the last thing I said inside conference room B was 3 words. Good luck, Greg. Then I walked out calmly while half the executive floor pretended not to watch. The security guard followed me downstairs because apparently directors of safety become dangerous once they stop accepting liability waivers. His badge read M. Keller. Poor kid looked embarrassed the entire elevator ride. You don't have to do this, he muttered quietly. I know. Outside, the September air felt unusually warm. I placed my badge on the reception desk. Then I drove home. No tears. No dramatic speeches. No revenge fantasies. Just silence. Because what they didn't understand was this. I wasn't the threat. Reality was. And reality keeps immaculate records. Back in March, right after Greg started bypassing maintenance holds, I'd updated every compliance archive personally. Not altered. Not manipulated. Just organized. Timestamped escalation chains. Maintenance deferment approvals. Internal response acknowledgements. Inspection photographs. Supervisor sign-offs. Every unresolved issue cross-referenced against OSHA standards and internal corrective action policies. I also finalized the quarterly risk exposure audit they'd delayed reviewing twice already. 7 unresolved violations. 2 classified as repeat exposure risks. One classified as potential imminent hazard if operational conditions continued deteriorating. I submitted the report through formal channels the same afternoon I resigned. Email. Certified hard copies. Digital archive upload. Clean. Professional. Impossible to dispute later. Because documentation matters more than outrage. Always. What Greg never realized was that Sentinel automatically preserved escalation pathways permanently once a report exceeded 90 days unresolved. Meaning every ignored warning created its own historical trail. Including who saw it. Including when. Including whether they acknowledged it electronically before failing to act. I'd built Sentinel that way after an insurance arbitration disaster back in 2015 when a supervisor falsely claimed he never received hazard notifications. After that case, I stopped relying on memory and started relying on systems. Systems don't panic. Systems don't lie under pressure. 3 weeks after I left, Barry Collins called me from a blocked number during dinner. Barry had been maintenance director for almost 20 years. Smart man. Constantly exhausted. You hear about Doc C? He asked quietly. I heard maintenance staffing was reduced. Greg outsourced part of it. Of course he did. How bad? Long pause. They skipped hydraulic inspections again. I set my fork down. No injuries yet, Barry added quickly. But Dana, this place is getting sloppy. Sloppy. That word bothered me more than catastrophic. Because catastrophic sounds sudden. Sloppy means the decay is already normal. What about the ammonia valves? They pushed inspections another month. I closed my eyes briefly. Jesus. Yeah. Then Barry lowered his voice. People are starting to say your name carefully around here. I almost laughed at that. Corporate environments always become superstitious once consequences start arriving. 2 days later, I received my first voicemail from Greg. Dana, hey, quick question regarding Sentinel archival permissions. We're having some workflow visibility issues on the maintenance escalation side. Give me a call. Workflow visibility issues. Interesting phrase. I deleted the voicemail. Second voicemail arrived the next morning. Dana, we're trying to locate certain compliance pathways connected to legacy reporting structures. It'd probably be easier if you just walked somebody through the back-end logic. Back-end logic. Again, words he didn't actually understand. Sentinel wasn't malfunctioning. He simply didn't know how to navigate systems he never bothered learning because he assumed competent people would always remain nearby to save him. I didn't call back. By October, rumors started reaching me through former coworkers. Production delays increasing. Maintenance turnover climbing. Supervisors overriding safety holds verbally to avoid documentation. That last part was especially reckless. Written violations are expensive. Unwritten violations become criminal. Then the contractor incident happened. A third-party electrical crew nearly energized an active conveyor during partial maintenance because permit verification procedures had been shortened to improve operational fluidity. Operational fluidity. That phrase actually made me laugh out loud when Barry repeated it over the phone. Nobody even knows what that means, he said. It means Greg read half a business article on LinkedIn. Barry snorted. Then his voice turned serious again. Dana, people are scared. I looked out my kitchen window for a long moment. Then they should leave. The real collapse started in November. Ridgeline landed a major regional distribution contract worth roughly $11 million annually. Greg pushed production quotas immediately. 12-hour rotations. Deferred maintenance windows. Reduced shutdown intervals. Crosscheck would have flagged the entire thing within 48 hours. Except Greg had disabled automated quota escalation reviews because they were, and I quote, algorithmically pessimistic. That decision lasted 11 days before Assembly Line 2 overheated during overnight production. Emergency shutdown. 17-hour production stoppage. Estimated losses just over $430,000. And suddenly my phone started ringing constantly. First Barry. Then Linda. Then supervisors I hadn't heard from in months. Finally Greg himself. I answered the fourth call mostly because I was curious how desperate he sounded. Dana, he said immediately, we need to collaboratively resolve some operational continuity gaps. There it was again. The MBA dialect. What kind of gaps? The production analytics environment isn't interfacing correctly with compliance protocols. You disabled crosscheck. Brief silence. We made temporary adjustments. You turned it off. It was creating throughput resistance. I leaned back in my chair. And now? Another silence. Longer this time. We need assistance restoring system efficiencies. Translation. Everything's falling apart. What exactly are you asking for, Greg? His tone tightened slightly. As the architect of these systems, you have institutional knowledge critical to continuity. Interesting. 3 months earlier, my institutional thinking was holding the company back. Now my institutional knowledge was critical. Funny how operational philosophy changes once losses hit 6 figures. I'm not an employee anymore. We can discuss consulting compensation. There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. A transaction. I almost respected the predictability. How much downtime so far? I asked. He hesitated. Approximately 19 hours cumulative. Meaning worse than Barry reported. And the unresolved OSHA escalations? Silence again. That silence told me everything. Good night, Greg. Dana, wait. I hung up. The next morning Linda called. Not as HR. As herself. You were right, she said quietly. I made coffee while she talked. They still haven't corrected all 7 violations, she continued. And now there's talk OSHA may do a regional sweep before year-end because of reporting inconsistencies. I stopped moving. What inconsistencies? Linda exhaled shakily. Somebody altered maintenance closure dates after you left. There it was. The moment the situation stopped being incompetence and started becoming something much more dangerous. When? Late October, I think. Dana, if inspectors compare timestamps against Sentinel archives, they will. Silence. Then Linda said the sentence that finally made me understand how scared they really were. Greg's been asking whether deleted audit trails can be recovered. I stared out the window at the freezing rain hitting my driveway. Because OSHA inspectors love one thing more than safety violations. Evidence somebody tried hiding them. And 3 days later, a regional compliance investigator parked outside Ridgeline Industrial Packaging at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning carrying a tablet full of records with my name attached to every unresolved warning they ignored. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. By the end of the 2nd week, the situation at Ridgeline had stopped being a safety problem. It became a credibility problem. And credibility collapses faster. The OSHA investigator stayed on site 4 consecutive days. That alone terrified everyone. Routine inspections don't last 4 days unless somebody keeps finding things. Barry called me every night afterward like a war correspondent reporting from the front. Today, they pulled machine isolation logs from packaging. Next night, they're interviewing floor supervisors individually now. Then, they asked for executive sign-off chains. That last one mattered. Because frontline mistakes are expensive. Executive acknowledgement is catastrophic. Apparently Greg tried managing the inspection the same way he managed operations. Fast talking. Buzzwords. Aggressive confidence wrapped around incomplete understanding. According to Barry, it went badly almost immediately. The investigator asked why multiple corrective actions remained unresolved despite escalation classifications exceeding mandatory remediation windows. Greg responded by saying Ridgeline had implemented adaptive compliance prioritization. Adaptive compliance prioritization. Even Barry sounded embarrassed repeating it. What did the inspector say? I asked. He just stared at Greg for a second and said, "That's not a real regulatory term." I actually smiled at that. Then things escalated. OSHA started cross-referencing Sentinel timestamps against altered maintenance closure records Linda warned me about. That was the moment legal got involved. Not internal legal. External legal. Because somebody inside Ridgeline had changed documented remediation dates after formal escalation filings. Federal investigators tend to take a dim view of rewritten safety records. Funny like that. 3 days later, Ridgeline's largest regional client requested an emergency compliance review meeting. Midwest Agricultural Distribution. 7-year contract worth $14.2 million annually. They handled food-grade storage materials, which meant regulatory exposure terrified them more than production delays. Greg led the presentation himself. Another mistake. Barry later described it to me over bourbon at a quiet place near the interstate. Apparently, Greg walked into the client meeting carrying 32 slides of revised operational metrics and exactly zero understanding of the room. The client's compliance director opened with one sentence. "Are you currently under active OSHA corrective review?" Simple question. Greg tried dancing around it. "Well, we're proactively aligning operational modernization initiatives with evolving inspection frameworks." The client interrupted him. "Yes or no?" Long silence. Finally, Greg admitted OSHA had issued preliminary findings. Then he made the fatal mistake. He blamed legacy compliance inefficiencies, meaning me. Unfortunately for Greg, Midwest Agricultural's compliance director had worked with me directly for 8 years. Her name was Susan Keller. Sharp woman. No patience for executive theater. Barry said she leaned forward slowly and asked one question. "Dana Mercer signed every clean audit your company produced for nearly a decade. Are you suggesting she caused this?" Nobody answered immediately. Because there was no safe answer. The client suspended contract renewal discussions 48 hours later pending independent review. That loss alone triggered panic at board level. Not concern. Panic. There's a difference. Concern still believes problems can be managed quietly. Panic starts scheduling emergency meetings. The board arrived the following Monday. Not all of them. Just enough to signal danger. Thomas Whitmore suddenly stopped appearing beside his son in public meetings after that. Interesting coincidence. Linda called me that evening. "They're tearing through records upstairs," she said quietly. "Outside counsel. Insurance people. Everyone. How's Greg handling it?" Silence. Then she laughed once. Not happily. He tried explaining OSHA classifications during a board review and confused repeat violation with repeat observation. One of the board members corrected him in front of everyone. I leaned against my kitchen counter. "Ouch!" "He's unraveling, Dana." That part one believed immediately. Men like Greg depend heavily on uninterrupted confidence. Once publicly embarrassed, they deteriorate fast. Especially around people they can't intimidate. Then came the financial hit. Ridgeline's insurance carrier initiated a temporary risk reassessment pending regulatory outcome. Premium increases alone projected at $670,000 annually. Meanwhile, overtime costs surged because production schedules kept collapsing under emergency shutdowns. And CrossCheck remained disabled because nobody else fully understood how to recalibrate it safely without corrupting archived predictive thresholds. That sentence sounds technical. Here's what it actually meant. Ridgeline no longer had a functioning system warning them before operational decisions became dangerous. So management started driving blind, which is apparently very efficient right up until the wall appears. 2 weeks later, a supervisor authorized partial restart on Assembly Line 2 without finalized thermal diagnostics because production quotas were already behind by 18%. The restart triggered an electrical fault cascade that shut down 3 interconnected lines simultaneously. 43 hours offline. Estimated losses just over $1.1 million. And suddenly Thomas Whitmore himself started calling me. The first voicemail sounded formal. "Dana, I believe there may be an opportunity for constructive dialogue." The second sounded strained. "We'd appreciate your perspective regarding certain operational stabilization efforts." By the third voicemail, all the executive phrasing disappeared. "Dana, please call me back." I waited another day before responding. Not strategically. Honestly, I was gardening. When I finally answered, Thomas sounded older than I remembered. "We need to meet." "About what?" Long pause. "About coming back." I clipped a dead branch from my hydrangeas while he talked. Interesting how calm ordinary tasks feel while billion-dollar personalities collapse in the background. "I'm not interested in returning as director," I said. "We can discuss expanded authority." "You already discussed my replacement publicly." That was a mistake. First honest sentence I'd heard from leadership in months. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. Board conference room." "I'll think about it." "Dana." His voice lowered slightly. This company cannot survive another quarter like this. There it was. Not ego anymore. Reality. I agreed to the meeting mostly because Barry texted me 15 minutes later. Please help us. Not the executives. Us. That mattered. The meeting happened Thursday at 8 a.m. on the top floor. Same building. Different atmosphere. The receptionist who once watched security escort me out now stood up so fast she nearly dropped her coffee. Good morning, Ms. Mercer. Funny how titles return once liability enters the conversation. Board conference room overlooked the parking lot and freight lanes behind the plant. Rain streaked the windows. Thomas sat at the head of the table beside two board members, outside counsel, Linda and Greg. Greg looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes. Jaw tight. Suit wrinkled for the first time since I'd met him. Like exhaustion had finally broken through the executive costume. Nobody offered small talk. Thomas folded his hands carefully. We'd like to discuss your return to Ridgeline. As what? He glanced briefly toward the board members. Chief Safety and Operational Compliance Officer. New title. Executive level. Reporting directly to the board. Not operations. Interesting. What happened to operational modernization? I asked calmly. Nobody answered. Greg stared at the table. Thomas slid a compensation packet across toward me. Base salary, $410,000 annually. Nearly triple my previous compensation. Performance equity options. Retention bonus. Independent staffing authority. I skimmed it once. Then closed the folder. No. Every person at the table visibly stiffened. Thomas blinked slowly. No, you still think this is primarily a compensation issue. Silence. Then Greg spoke for the first time. We're offering an extraordinary package. I looked at him. You altered compliance records after unresolved escalation filings. His face tightened immediately. We corrected administrative inconsistencies. No, I interrupted quietly. You rewrote timestamps attached to federally discoverable documentation. The room went silent. Not uncomfortable silence. Dangerous silence. Greg looked toward Thomas for support. Didn't get any. I continued calmly. If I return, conditions will be non-negotiable. Thomas nodded slowly. Go ahead. I opened my notebook. Not dramatically. Just prepared. Because preparation unnerves people who rely on improvisation. First, full operational authority over all compliance, maintenance escalation, and shutdown enforcement procedures. No executive override authority outside documented board review. Thomas nodded immediately. Second, Sentinel and Crosscheck reinstated fully under independent compliance administration. Another nod. Third, Eli Ramirez, Barry Collins, and all displaced maintenance staff offered reinstatement with salary adjustments and written acknowledgement that prior safety escalation concerns were valid. Linda actually looked relieved hearing that. Greg looked furious. Good. Fourth, I continued, independent remediation partnership with the OSHA consulting firm conducting corrective review. Thomas frowned slightly. You want outside oversight? I want accountability. Greg finally snapped. That would expose internal operational failures to third-party review. I looked directly at him. Yes, you're asking us to institutionalize reputational damage. No, I'm asking you to stop creating it. Silence again. One of the board members, older woman named Patricia Boone, finally spoke. How much authority would this external firm have? Full audit visibility. Greg shook his head immediately. That's completely unreasonable. I leaned back calmly. Then you don't need me. And that was the moment everything changed. Because for the first time since I'd entered the room, panic became visible. Not in Greg. In Thomas. He turned toward his son slowly. Greg, he said carefully, I think it may be time for you to listen. That sentence landed harder than shouting ever could have. Greg opened his mouth. Closed it again. I continued. Final condition. Formal findings report submitted to the board documenting operational decisions contributing to compliance failure, including executive override patterns and record alteration attempts. Greg stood up so suddenly his chair rolled backward. That's absurd. No, I said quietly. That's the job. Thomas rubbed his forehead. Dana, if you want me back, the company tells the truth first. Nobody spoke for almost 20 seconds. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Finally, Patricia Boone looked toward Thomas. She's right. Another board member nodded. Then Linda spoke quietly from the far end of the table. She's been right the entire time. Greg looked around the room like he'd just realized support had evaporated while he was busy talking. Honestly, it was difficult not to feel slightly bad for him. Slightly. Thomas exhaled slowly. Done. Greg turned toward him immediately. You can't seriously. I can, Thomas interrupted. That shut him up. Thomas looked back at me. All conditions accepted. I held his gaze another few seconds, then nodded once. Okay. The walk back into Ridgeline the following Monday felt stranger than I expected. Not triumphant. Heavier than that. People straightened when I passed through production. Some looked relieved. Others looked embarrassed. Most just looked tired. Barry met me near maintenance control carrying 2 coffees. You have any idea how weird this is? He asked. Yes. You got escorted out 3 months ago. I remember. And now they gave you the executive parking space. I took the coffee from him. Life moves quickly. Barry laughed for the first time in weeks. That part felt nice. Eli Ramirez found me 20 minutes later near Assembly Line 2. They actually apologized, he said quietly. Who? HR, operations. Everybody. He still sounded shocked by it. You coming back? I asked. With a raise, he said carefully. And they're restoring full maintenance staffing. Good. Then Eli lowered his voice. People stopped sleeping around here, Dana. That's how bad it got. That sentence stayed with me. Because safety failures aren't really about regulations. They're about exhaustion. Fear. Workers driving home wondering whether management still values their lives more than quarterly metrics. The first executive meeting after my return lasted 6 hours. I reinstated mandatory shutdown authority immediately. Restored automated escalation chains. Reactivated cross-check predictive thresholds. And implemented a new policy requiring dual-signature executive acknowledgement for deferred maintenance risk exposure. Simple version. Nobody could quietly bury safety problems anymore. Especially not executives. Greg attended the meeting silently. Also new. At one point, he tried objecting to a mandatory refrigeration overhaul timeline. Patricia Boone stopped him mid-sentence. Dana's recommendation stands. The look on his face was almost fascinating. Not anger. Disorientation. Like he genuinely couldn't understand why confidence alone no longer worked. By January, the OSHA corrective framework was fully underway. The outside consulting firm assigned to remediation partnered directly with me. Ironically, they offered me a standing advisory contract before the first quarter ended. Apparently, federal investigators appreciate organized documentation. Who knew? The final OSHA settlement hit Ridgeline in February. Total penalties, remediation costs, insurance increases, production losses, legal exposure, and contract restructuring impacts came to just under $6.8 million. Expensive lesson. Still cheaper than a funeral. 6 months later, Ridgeline barely resembled the company Greg tried to optimize. Incident rates dropped another 22%. Maintenance compliance reached 98.4%. Employee retention stabilized for the first time in nearly 2 years. And Midwest Agricultural renewed their contract after independent review closed successfully. Susan Keller personally called me afterward. I knew something was wrong the second they pushed you out, she said. That obvious? Dana, competent people don't usually get removed during compliance crises unless somebody important is making stupid decisions. Fair point. Barry became Senior Director of Infrastructure Reliability. Eli moved into plant operations safety coordination with a salary increase big enough that he finally bought the fishing boat he'd been talking about for years. Linda left HR entirely and transitioned into corporate ethics oversight. That one made me especially happy. As for Greg, he stayed. Technically. The board stripped operational override authority from his office entirely. Every strategic recommendation now required independent compliance review. He still attended meetings. Still wore expensive suits. But he listened more. Spoke less. And every time he started drifting toward presentation jargon, somebody eventually asked the same question. What does that actually mean operationally? Amazing how healthy organizations improve once people stop pretending vague language counts as competence. Oddly enough, my own life improved too. Not just professionally. Personally. For 18 years, I treated exhaustion like evidence of commitment. After I came back, I stopped doing that. I took weekends off occasionally. Started seeing someone patient enough to understand why I still checked emergency alert notifications during dinner. Even went back to Vancouver eventually. Different trip. Better company. One morning about 8 months after my return, I arrived at the plant before sunrise and sat alone in the executive parking space for a minute with the engine running. Same faint clicking sound from the dashboard. Same early morning cold. Only this time, nobody was calling to warn me OSHA had arrived. Because OSHA already had copies of everything they needed. And Ridgeline had finally learned something most companies learn too late. Safety isn't expensive. Ignoring competent people is. I still think about that Tuesday morning sometimes. Barry whispering through the phone. Greg searching desperately for records he didn't understand. The investigators walking through production carrying folders full of warnings nobody respected until federal badges entered the building. The truth is, I never wanted Ridgeline to fail. Most people in positions like mine don't. We want systems to work. We want workers safe. We want leadership smart enough to understand that procedures written in blood usually exist for a reason. But arrogance has a strange effect on organizations. It convinces people they can negotiate with reality. You can't. Reality always wins eventually. It just keeps cleaner documentation than most executives expect. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the people calling your standards excessive are usually the ones least prepared for the bill when those standards disappear.